Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Matt King. I'm a Privacy and Data Protection Manager in the state's Office of Privacy and Data Protection within WaTech. And today we are going to be talking about some de-identification concepts and considerations. Turning to the agenda here, we'll start with an overview to help ground us in the conversation about what is and is not personal information as kind of the starting place for this. Walk through some basic terminology to keep in mind when we're talking about de-identification that can sometimes be a little different than the terms that we're otherwise used to working with on privacy topics. We're going to talk about why we want to de-identify information and why this is an important concept. And hopefully there we'll connect a little bit about some concepts that you're probably already doing, whether you are thinking about it as de-identification or not. We'll talk about some specific techniques for de-identification, and then we'll also get into implementation considerations. I think we're also going to set the record today for most words that end in TION. I think we're up to 4 so far, and we got a couple more in store for you later. A reminder that although it's difficult to talk about privacy without talking to some extent about legal requirements, this presentation is for informational purposes only and is not legal advice. The information here reflects our current understanding, and best practices change over time according to context, and you should consult your attorneys on specific questions. So starting with that basic idea of what is personal information. So we use a pretty broad general definition, which is just information that is identifiable directly or indirectly to a specific individual. There are lots of little variations that you will run into out there in the world that come from different jurisdictions and different laws or just different practices that people have picked up. And sometimes there are some tweaks in the definitions of these, but we also see different terms that more or less we treat as being the same. So for example, we see personal data, especially if people are used to operating internationally and in particular in Europe where they use that term. We see personally identifiable information with the acronym of PII, which is very common here in the United States. And then a variation of that, we also see individually identifiable information. So there are some differences between these terms if you really get into the details. And there are some people that really do like to parse the differences between them. But for our purposes, we try to keep this pretty general idea of just information directly or indirectly identifiable and use these more or less interchangeably. Just to highlight a little bit of where we see some of that variation with a couple of examples. The first one here is from the My Health, My Data Act in Washington State, which does directly include a similar definition of being reasonably capable of being associated or linked directly or indirectly with the particular consumer. So that idea of directly or indirectly is going to be important later. One of the bigger variations that we see definitions is highlighted by this definition from the California Consumer Privacy Act, which starts off very similarly as My Health, My Data, but then it adds that it's not just directly or indirectly with a particular consumer, but it's also with a particular consumer or household. So that is especially impactful with certain types of identifying information where it may be that an identifier is associated with a house or a family rather than a particular individual. So examples of that could be something like a street address where more than one person lives, or a telephone number if you still have a landline where it's associated with more than one person, or something like an IP address where it could be associated with all the people in a particular household that are using a particular device. So a little bit of a more expansive definition that also kind of reflects the way that the digital world works and how those identifiers work. And then we have the General Data Protection Regulation from Europe, or the GDPR, which also is pretty similar to what we had in that My Health, My Data definition, except that it also adds some details around different types of identifiers as examples. There are some common exceptions that we see when we look at those definitions. One of the big ones, especially in the United States, is about publicly available information. So, this is information that's already out there in the public domain and is not being protected. So, examples, especially from or through the government lens, could be things like property ownership records and deeds, and professional licenses. And so those are things that, at least for purposes of those laws, are often exempted. But we know that here we use a more general definition and just sweep everything in as is it identifiable or not. Um, Another common exception in those laws is information in the employment or business to business context. The notable exception about that one is that in California, there actually is no longer an exception for information gathered in the employment context, which is going to be interesting to watch how that plays out because an employee's relationship with their employer is a little bit different than the way a consumer normally interacts with a company. So those will be interesting developments to follow. Then we also have more specific definitions that are within the broader category of personal information. These are often called sensitive information. Oh, that's not the terminology we necessarily use. But these are subsets that may have heightened restrictions or heightened requirements wrapped around them. Um, Race or ethnicity are certainly included there, religious beliefs, but also other protected activities like political activities and political speech, mental and physical health, sexual orientation. You could also put in there things like gender affirming care. We also see citizenship or immigration status, genetic or biometric information. We've had other webinars here where we talk about some of the particular Washington requirements around biometrics. And then also children or information about children is also called out in an area that's often has its own requirements that apply. And there's another way, or another place where we see a definition of personal information, which is in our state breach notification law. It has a definition here of basically being personal information as a person's name in combination with one of these elements. This is not the definition of personal information that we use when we're thinking about things from a policy perspective and whether we want to consider impacts to individuals. And the reason for that is that the breach notification law is very specifically focused on financial harm and identity theft. So what you see here are identifiers that could be used to harm somebody financially, which is not the entire scope of potential privacy harms. So it's something that's out there and that we frequently get questions about. It is helpful to understand it, especially if you're involved in incident response in any way, but it's not the general definition that we normally use. And then one other concept that's important for this conversation is the idea of data classification, which is a schema that we have specific to Washington State to classify information into general buckets where we should have similar controls wrapped around that information. And it requires classifying data from category 1 to 4, with category 1 being public information, all the way up to category 4, which is confidential with other special handling requirements around it. And the key distinction here is that category 1 and 2 are subject to public disclosure, while category 3 and 4 are not subject to public disclosure. This is another area where there's sometimes some confusion around how this interacts with personal information. And the reason is that personal information can be category one, two, three, or four. Sometimes we have personal information that is category one that we intend to publish. So things like professional licenses that I mentioned a minute ago would be an example of that, where it is out there in the public domain. But we also have lots of personal information that has confidentiality restrictions wrapped around it. So there is not a direct relationship here, and we do care about how we're processing personal information, even if it is only category one or two. So to bring this together, just want to really emphasize that there where we're talking about personal information is defined by policy. That's our general definition of personal information. That's really broad, which is separate from personal information under our breach notification law and also separate from our definitions of category 3 or category 4 information, although there is often overlap between them. I'm going to switch to some of the foundational basic terminology that we use when we're talking about identifiability and de-identification. And the first one is around the concept of direct identifiers. So these are data elements that can uniquely identify a person without additional information. So examples here would be something like a name, and that would include all versions of names, first, last, middle names, aliases, maiden names. We also have government issued identifiers, again, where there's a one-to-one relationship there. So common examples would be a social security number or a driver's license number or a passport number. Contact information normally also falls under the direct identifier bucket. So this would be those street addresses I mentioned earlier, email addresses, phone numbers, and those types of identifying information. And then other general identifiers that are assigned for various reasons would also fall into the direct identifier category. So an example here would be like your financial account number, or in the healthcare context, you could think about your healthcare plan number or even the specific number assigned to a specific healthcare record. And those would all be examples of direct identifiers. Then the corollary to that is if we have direct identifiers, we also have indirect identifiers. And these are elements that are not uniquely tied to a specific person, but they can be used in combination to identify a specific person. So these are basically characteristics that can apply to a lot of different people, but with enough indirect identifiers, then you can re-identify a person, even if a specific record or data set doesn't contain any of those direct identifiers. So examples of this are we have things like demographics, so things like gender and race and ethnicity. We have geographic information, so this could be things like a more general location than a street address, but things like a zip code or a city. We have date ranges, which could be things like the date of birth or a date of death, or a date of a particular receive or a particular service. Event dates, again, like something like the date of a procedure. Medical diagnoses can be something that, again, on its own is not very identifiable, but in combination can be used to identify people, and socioeconomic status. So this could be a pretty broad bucket of things, including income or your job or your level of education. The next concept here for de-identification is the idea of transformation. So this is just simply the idea of doing something to those data elements. So in the context of de-identification specifically, we're talking about the techniques used to make personal information non-identifiable. So just a high level on this for now, because we'll talk about it more in a bit. But examples of transformation would be like removing information, masking the information, or generalizing the information. Before we get to de-identification, the first stop here is to talk about pseudonymization. So this is the idea where we're not transforming all of the identifying information. We're simply transforming the direct identifiers. So pseudonymized data means there are no direct identifiers remaining or the record or data set. So this is similar to how we usually encounter this term with something like a pen name where the real name isn't used. Same idea here, where a common technique is going to be replacing those direct identifiers with randomly generated values that don't uniquely identify the person. The next step on that journey is to de-identification itself, which is the process of transforming personal information so that no identifiers remain. So now we're talking about both direct and indirect identifiers. And so when we talk about de-identified data, whether that's a particular record or data set, we're talking about information that has a very low risk of re-identification. And this is an important concept because the idea is going to vary depending on the context and your risk threshold and who the recipient of the information is. So really a lot of considerations in figuring out how you set that very low threshold. And then when you're doing that, again, you need to consider whether the information that's left that hasn't been transformed can be used alone or in combination with other information to identify a person. So not only considering the information in the data set, but also what other information does a likely recipient have access to. And then the last stop here on the journey is anonymization. So this is the idea where your level of de-identification, where the risk of somebody being re-identified is approximately equal to zero. So this is a concept that we see especially in Europe. It explicitly endorses this idea. In practice, we know that it's often difficult or impossible to actually completely anonymize personal information. Um, but it is, especially here in the United States, sometimes used interchangeably with the term of de-identification. And for our purposes, we'll more often focus on that de-identification idea. So bringing this all together, what you end up with is a spectrum of identifiability, where on the left you basically have 100% identifiability. Someone could definitely clearly be identified from the information in the record itself. Then you go to pseudonymous information where those direct identifiers are removed, then all the way to de-identified, and finally on the far end to the right, you have anonymous information where the identifiability is set to zero. Um, a really important concept to keep in mind here is that um, identifiable information and pseudonymous information are both still personal information, and it's only when you cross that threshold to being de-identified information that you get to the point of it not being considered personal information. And as I mentioned, that exercise of figuring out exactly where that line is often a risk and legal determination of when you have sufficiently removed or transformed information to cross that threshold. But there are some examples out there to look to and best practices in figuring out how exactly you do make that determination. So one question you may be asking is why would you want to de-identify at all? More robust data is often more useful. Well, the main concept here is that if identifiable information equals personal information, then de-identified information does not equal personal information, which potentially is going to remove a lot of restrictions on what you can do with that information, and is also very consistent with some of our Washington State agency privacy principles. So the first of those, and probably most significant, is around data minimization, which is the basic idea that the minimum amount of information is collected, used, or shared for a particular purpose. So de-identification is a concept that we use across this entire life cycle. We certainly think about whether we need to include or collect any of those direct or indirect identifiers at the time we're collecting it. But then once you have it, that exercise doesn't end, right? We have lots of opportunities to further de-identify the information for our internal or external uses and when we're sharing the information as well. So even if you need to gather very detailed information for identity verification, as an example, that doesn't mean that you then need to use all of that information for the rest of your analytics. It may be that you can then strip it out, maybe even strip out the names, right? And then you're just doing the analysis on the remaining data. So this is something that we want to apply across that life cycle. I mentioned the idea of reducing our data handling requirements. So one angle to that is around our statutory compliance. We know we have many state agencies subject to various privacy laws, and those laws tend to really explicitly contemplate the idea of de-identifying data. So it's not just something that we are inferring. They actually have explicit statements. So in HIPAA, we have the statement that health information that doesn't identify an individual is not individually identifiable health information. In the GDPR, we have this idea that the principles of data protection shouldn't apply to information that's not identifiable. And then in My Health, My Data, we again have that really explicit idea that personal information doesn't include the identified information. This also, in addition to applying to like what we can and can't do with the information, from like a data protection perspective, it also has implications from a security perspective. So a lot of those statutory compliance requirements also include security controls that may not apply if you don't have personal information. And also our Washington State security requirements often depend on data classification. So even though data categories are not exactly the same as defining whether something is personal information, in many cases, if you remove personal information from a data set, it will move it from category 3 or 4 to being category 1 or 2, which means less stringent security controls. This is also a really important concept around government transparency and this tension that we have between the fact that the information we collect and retain as agencies are public records and subject to disclosure, but yet at the same time we're trying to protect the sensitive information about the people we are serving. So when we're thinking about public records requests in particular under the Public Records Act, the exemptions that apply to that for personal information often hinge on whether responsive records have personal information or not. So de-identifying information is a way that allows us to meet our public records demands around transparency and maintaining public trust, while also protecting privacy. And then also these concepts are really important for the idea of open data, so data that's freely available to access, use, and share. And as I mentioned, this is especially a little bit of a complicated topic in the space of open data because there are some types of personal information that we do intend to be out there in the public domain, but lots of others where the information can be valuable to the public, but also we need to be very careful to make sure we're not accidentally publishing re-identifiable information. And then the last concept here around why de-identification is valuable is the idea of purpose limitation. So this is the principle where We figure out why we're going to use information before we collect it. We're going to, and then only use it for those purposes later on. Um, De-identifying information can allow us to make more uses that are different from the original purpose, by removing the sensitivity in the information and making it not personal information anymore. So the top of mind example recently for this is things like using information in artificial intelligence tools where we may not want to put personal information into those tools, but if we can strip the personal information out of those tools, then we may be able to put high quality data in and have outcomes that benefit the people we're serving and help us fulfill our missions. So going into some of the techniques and the kind of types of transformations we actually do, um, the, there's a pretty big caveat here that a lot of these techniques do require some technical expertise to apply, especially or from a technical perspective in terms of how you apply them with things like encryption, but also from more of a mathematical or statistical perspective in terms of the likelihood of re-identification. And this is not intended to be a technical training on those pieces. But even if you are not handling those technical or statistical pieces, it is still incredibly helpful to understand these core concepts. And part of that is because there are also really critical non-technical skills that help make decisions around de-identification. So some of those things include understanding the business operating context. What are you trying to accomplish, both like overall for a particular data collection activity, but also when you're going through the de-identification process, why are you doing that? What is the utility you're trying to keep intact? It's really helpful to have an understanding of applicable laws and what other handling requirements may apply, which could be not just legal requirements or policy requirements, but also just general expectations from your customers. And then also understanding kind of what those common internal and external business uses actually are. So those are critical pieces of the conversation where, again, even if you're not doing the technical piece, by bringing that to the conversation, you're help bridging that gap and make good decisions about how you handle this information. The first concept is the most technical of them, which is the idea of transforming direct identifiers using some type of technical method like encryption, hashing, or tokenization. So symmetric encryption, as the first example here, is where you have a shared secret key to encrypt, and you're using the same key to encrypt and decrypt. So in that way, it is a reversible activity. You can hash it and add salt, which is a method of allowing some secure verification, but it is not reversible like symmetric encryption is. And then you have tokenization, which is using tokens as a replacement for real data. So this is kind of like the in-between, where the real data still exists, but it is stored separately in a separate place, and those tokens are used in the data set itself. So in figuring out which of these you may want to use, you need to always be considering the use case. So one question to ask at the beginning is, do you need to be able to reverse it? So if you do, symmetric encryption is more likely going to be the thing that you want to look at, although tokenization can also help. You're going to need access to the vault or wherever else that real data is stored, but it is reversible, whereas using the hash and salt is not. You want to think about, do you need to maintain the format? Like, it doesn't need to be in the same 9-digit social security number format as an example. And if that's the case, then something like tokenization is most likely the most appropriate. And then you also need to think about, do you actually need the real data to do whatever the thing is, whatever the use case is, whether it's analysis or something else? And if you need the real data, then symmetric encryption that retains that data in the data set is probably the most helpful. So again, we're not going to go super deep into these, but I do want to highlight that these methods are available and can be really helpful to help transform those direct identifiers, so especially when we're talking about pseudonymization. The next thing that's less technical and I think more commonly seen, still focusing on those direct identifiers, is the idea of randomization. So this is where we're just replacing identifiers with random values, but it's not necessarily rising to the level of encryption. So again, here you want to consider what your use case is going to be. Um, if you want to do like broad sharing of the information, and you just want to like get it out the door and have it not be identifiable, then randomization is probably the easiest method. But if you're doing really detailed like longitudinal analysis where you need to be able to recognize the same person in different records over time, then, or when you're combining data sets and need to be able to have that unique identifier between them, then something like tokenization is probably going to work better than just randomization. Then we get into the next one, which is probably the most straightforward of the techniques, which is used for both direct and indirect identifiers. And this is field suppression, or more simply redaction, or just taking stuff out. So this could be removing an element from a record or data set, and it could be the entire element, which is like if you think about a spreadsheet where you're getting rid of the columns, or you're getting rid of all those values for every record in the data set. It could be the entire record. So on that spreadsheet, instead of the column, thinking about a particular row where maybe there's something about that specific entry that has unique characteristics that make a person more identifiable. Or you could be redacting or removing just specific values, or going cell by cell through that imaginary spreadsheet. And that obviously is a more intensive exercise, but it's important to keep in mind that you could be doing any one of three things or any combination of those three types of suppression. Um, Again, when we're doing this, we want to again consider the use case. We often use this type of redaction or suppression for public records purposes, because things like encrypting a record to send it out in response to the Public Records Act probably isn't going to fly. Um, uh, it may also be appropriate for data analysis in some cases. And in those situations, you really need to work closely with the people who are actually going to be doing the analysis and figuring out, going through that data minimization exercise and figuring out exactly what is necessary for a particular outcome. And then one other call out here is that on its own, field suppression is probably not going to be helpful for the development context where you're actually working on tools and need to test them, because if you're removing those fields, that's going to impact functionality later on. The next technique is generalization. So this is where we're not removing values, but we're instead replacing them with less granular details. So instead of including a particular day, for example, you include a week or a month or a year. So we most often see generalization in things that naturally occur along a range, like dates or in geographic information, where you can go from, as I mentioned earlier, from a street address to a city to a zip code to a county to a state. So when you're thinking about your particular use here, you want to think about or you want to go through and look at the particular elements themselves and figure out which ones are going to reduce identifiability the most while having the least impact on utility, which is going to vary from use case to use case. And then you also want to think about how much generalization do you need to do to accomplish whatever that purpose is, which again is going to vary. Sometimes it may be enough to go out to the zip code level, and in other situations, because of some unique characteristics in a data set, you may need to go out to a county or a region or a state. So when we're comparing this data to suppression, it does allow more data to remain, but it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily as accurate as if the original information had been there. And then we get to perturbation, which haven't quite worked out how to say without sounding silly yet. But this is the idea of introducing noise into data. So this is where you're somehow altering or swapping or rounding the values. And what I mean by swapping there is where you're taking real values from different records in a data set and swapping particular cells in between the records. So on average, one benefit of this is it can help maintain statistical accuracy for a data set overall, as long as you're not adding too much noise. Um, uh, but one big thing to keep in mind is that this is not, again, not a great tool for things like the public records context, and often is a bit of a challenge with the public sector's uses of data in particular, because you're basically introducing fake data into the data set, which could be perceived incorrectly or used incorrectly. And it's important to understand that when you do this, you're no longer using real data. So we're next going to switch to some of the main considerations to keep in mind as you're making decisions around de-identification and thinking about how to implement those particular techniques. And the first is one that I already touched on a little bit, which is just recognizing that there is a tension here. There's an inherent balancing act around how we maintain privacy, and we also have usable data. So if we had this on an axis, right, you on one end you would have maximum privacy and no utility, and on the other end you'd have maximum utility and no privacy. And the goal of thinking about these different techniques and thinking about where you set this risk threshold is to really be able to use de-identification to find the right balance between what those business needs are, what that utility is, while also preserving privacy. We want to also think about how we go about calculating risk. And I did promise this is not a technical training, but it is helpful to have a basic grounding what that risk calculation would look like, which is basically that the risk identification or risk of re-identification is the vulnerabilities of re-identification times the likelihood of somebody trying to re-identify information. So when we're thinking about first that acceptable risk level of like what when you multiply the vulnerability times the likelihood, like what number are we okay with accepting? One of the things we want to think about is, do we have applicable laws? I'll give an example of that later. But sometimes you get some pretty helpful guidance around where to set those thresholds. We want to think about whether the data set includes sensitive information, and in particular, is it information that could harm people if somebody was re-identified, and if so, how could it harm people? And those are considerations where obviously the more significant the repercussions are of somebody being re-identified, then the less risk appetite we should have in around where that de-identification standard is. We want to think about who the recipient is going to be, which goes directly to the idea of what is the likelihood of an attack or of somebody trying to re-identify a person. So the first consideration is, what other information does the recipient have? So you could consider information that's just out there in the public domain, either for free or that could be purchased. Another consideration that often comes up in the public sector is, do you serve similar populations? So, for example, if you have a state agency that serves a particular group of people, and a local government that serves the same group of people, you can share data sets between you and de-identify them. But if the other recipient wants to re-identify people in that, they very likely have the ability to do that based on serving those same populations and having that really granular data to compare to. And along those lines, you want to think about what the controls are in place for those particular recipients. So when we think about controls, we could, for internal uses, we could think about things, policy requirements, but especially when we're sharing data externally, Then we want to think about, do we have contractual controls that include things like a commitment to not re-identify and a monitoring plan to make sure that is not happening? And then also just at a really high level, who is the recipient? Why do they want the information? And do you think that they're likely to try to re-identify individuals? We want to look at how identifiable the information is itself. So obviously, if it includes direct identifiers, it's going to be pretty identifiable. We want to look at how many indirect identifiers are included. So like one indirect identifier is not very likely to re-identify somebody, but we could think about this through the lens of something like location data, where one data point of where someone is at a particular point in time is not very identifiable. But if you have 30 data points or bigger than that, you could really quickly figure out from otherwise non-identifiable information who someone is, where they live, where they work, where their kids go to school, and all kinds of other sensitive information about them. And then similar to that, we want to think about how identifiable are the specific elements in the context of the data set. And what I mean by that is like, what are the distribution of values within that data set? And are there particular elements that are more identifiable than others? So for example, if you have income as an element and there are some extreme outliers, then it may be that those could very easily be used to re-identify people. So you want to consider that context and the data within a particular set. I talked a little bit about how this interacts with the Public Records Act, so I want to call that out a little bit more here. Um, the the first thing, again, records maintained by public agencies are public records, and they are subject to disclosure unless a specific exemption applies. And we have been instructed that that should be liberally construed and its exemptions narrowly tailored, which can leave us in a bit of an awkward situation sometimes. So when we're calculating risk for a public release, we're basically assuming that that recipient has access to lots of other information and they have an intent to re-identify an individual. And we also have we do not have the ability to use contracts like we do in other situations to restrict the ability to re-identify or how they're going to use that information. And we also have less ability to look beyond the record itself. So a lot of the stuff that I've talked about around the ability to combine with other information and what other information does the recipient have access to, um, is not an allowance that we have with public records, where we're not supposed to look beyond the record itself. So we do have scenarios that come up where, for example, you don't have any direct identifiers in a record, but there's a high likelihood that the requester actually knows who the person is in responsive records. So examples of this include like a media request for an incident report where the name of the person who was involved has already been published and it's already out there in the public domain. Or you may just get very specific requests about something that particular or occurred at a particular time or in a particular location or about a very specific population, where you're not entirely sure that the person's re-identifiable, but it seems likely that they are, or that someone's trying to get at identifiable records. So there's no silver bullet for this. It does require some discretion, and I just want to call it out as an area that does have unique considerations. One thing that you can do to help with this is to whatever those de-identification standards are that you're using in the public records context, to make sure that they're documented. And there's various levels of formality around this. At the most formal, if you have gone through the rulemaking process, then that would give you the most authority to rely on if you get questions about why you're de-identifying in a certain way. But also even internal formal policies will at least demonstrate what your position is and help document that and establish consistency. And then the furthest down on that hierarchy there would be informal standards, which have the benefit of flexibility, but not the same benefits around consistency across application. The idea of documentation in general is helpful with this, regardless of whether you're in the public records context or not. It can help you if you do get into trouble around these decisions with defending actions on why you did or did not de-identify in a certain way. I mentioned it can help ensure consistency. And it also helps even when you're not in that public records context, when you're in the posture of sharing with other interested parties, whether it's legislators or other community members or private sector partners who may want more data than you're willing to give them. And having those standards really clearly documented to fall back on can be really helpful in those types of conversations. The last real consideration here to call out, and this could be its own standalone webinar, but for today, we're just going to talk very briefly about it, which is that the idea of aggregate reporting, which in this sense, I mean releasing summaries or counts instead of individual level information, that this does not automatically make information de-identified. You do need to still go through some type of re-identification exercise and figure out if you do have identifiable information in those counts. So I think the most common example that we see come up around this is with small numbers around, and particularly depending on the population or on a population size, where just having small values, especially under 10, can reveal individual identities, even when it is in this aggregated report. So an easy example of this would be something like school testing results for the state have a very different level of identifiability than school testing results for a specific elementary school. So you want to consider what those size thresholds might be, and you have other related tools around like upper and lower bounds of reporting that you are able to or that you may want to alter and how those reports are published. I want to think about secondary suppression when you're going through that exercise, which is that even removing one of those small numbers that could be identifiable on its own may not be enough. You may need to also suppress other numbers to prevent people from backing in to the small number. So again, we could have a whole other conversation on this, but the main takeaway for today is just that these aggregate reports are not automatically not personal information. So I mentioned that we have some helpful examples from applicable privacy laws out there, and I was going to walk through one of them to see how these things have actually been operationalized. And I know lots of folks are not subject to HIPAA, but I do think that this is a helpful example about how this has been actually implemented in practice and as a resource to consider if you don't have anything that directly applies to you and you want a starting place. I think this is a really good best practice to fall back on. So under HIPAA, we do have this general de-identification standard that at the outset, it explicitly accepts the concept of de-identification. It then specifies what those exact fields are that you need to suppress that I didn't publish here, but it's 18 direct and indirect identifiers that need to be removed. And then it also requires you to consider the context to make sure that there isn't other information that would actually let somebody be identified. And then overall, what this schema is doing is setting the threshold, figuring out what that risk threshold is where something is considered de-identified. There's the method I just went through is called the HIPAA safe harbor de-identification method. There's also something called the HIPAA expert determination de-identification standard. And this is basically recognizing that removing or doing field suppression is not the only way to do de-identification, that there are other things you can do. And in particular here, they call out again that the risk needs to be very small, that you need to consider a loner in combination, whether information can lead to somebody being identified, and that you need to also very explicitly consider who who the recipient is, and then at the end that you need to document the outcomes of that analysis. HIPAA also helpfully goes through some examples of pseudonymization. So the first one here is that they very explicitly allow you to use some kind of transformation like encryption or tokenization or randomization, where you're replacing direct identifiers with something else that doesn't directly re-identify the person, and that in doing that you need to also maintain security controls and not share keys around how that code is generated. And there is one other way that HIPAA also talks about pseudonymization, which is the concept of a limited data set, where it allows a covered entity, so someone subject to HIPAA, to disclose one of these data sets for specific purposes. So here, again, you have that contractual controls requirement. It Because it's pseudonymous, it requires indirect identifiers to remain, but requires direct identifiers to be removed. So significantly here, it would allow things like smaller geographic areas and dates. And then it also, again, requires you to consider context, and in that analysis, you're only allowed to use the information for very specific purposes. So again, not directly applicable to everybody, but a good example of all of these principles kind of being rolled up and operationalized in a legal standard. So key takeaways for today. Again, the idea that identifiability is a spectrum. So whether information is identified itself is a kind of a risk determination that falls somewhere along that spectrum that could vary from agency to agency or data set to data set. You need to understand whatever the applicable laws and handling requirements are, and similar to that, you need to understand the context and what you're trying to accomplish by undertaking the de-identification exercise, which is going to have an impact on that utility versus privacy trade-off. You need to continually review and adjust these standards as needed. Context changes. Again, we especially have seen that with artificial intelligence, where there's more access to information, and we need to keep that in mind when we make these risk determinations. You want to document whatever it is that you're doing. And then finally, those aggregate reports that get published need review as well. It's not only the individual level records that need review. So that brings us to a close. If you have remaining questions, you can send them to privacy@watech.wa.gov. Thanks for joining us.